In Laboratory Reddit, today's story is...
My mother-in-law secretly altered my wedding vows so I would swear to honor her and make her the foundation of our marriage. The officiant gave them to me minutes before the ceremony, saying, "Did you approve these changes?" Her face during my actual vows was unforgettable. I always knew my mother-in-law had a strong personality, but our wedding planning brought out her controlling side to a level that went beyond the usual. From the moment my fiancé and I got engaged, she meddled in every decision, acting as if the wedding was hers instead of ours. The first red flag arose with her strange interest in the vows. My fiancé and I had decided to write our own, to make the ceremony more personal. However, my mother-in-law kept bringing them up, insisting that she wanted to make sure they were, quote, sentimental enough. I found it weird, but I responded evasively to avoid conflicts. Then came the second sign. About a week before the wedding, she brought up the topic of vows again, but in a way that made me deeply uncomfortable. She casually suggested that it would be a touching tribute to include her in my vows, since I was joining her family. I laughed thinking she was joking, but her expression said otherwise. She argued that a wedding wasn't just about two people, but about uniting families. I changed the subject, hoping she would let it go. The real alarm sounded the night before the wedding. I was with my bridesmaids finalizing details when one of them mentioned something disturbing. She had overheard my mother-in-law whispering to the officiant about a last-minute change to the vows. The next morning, while preparations were in full swing, I couldn't get that worry out of my head. My mother-in-law was in a suspiciously cheerful mood, even smug, walking around the venue as if she were the star. Then came the moment I feared. About 30 minutes before the ceremony, the officiant approached me with a confused expression. He handed me a carefully folded paper, explaining that my mother-in-law had given it to him, insisting it was a last-minute update to my vows. He thought it was strange and wanted to confirm if I had actually approved the change. I told him no, I hadn't authorized any changes. Reading the content, within seconds I knew these weren't my vows at all, or at least they had been significantly altered. They started in a familiar way, but then transformed into something completely different. Paragraphs about always prioritizing my husband's family, seeking my mother-in-law's guidance, and valuing the wisdom of the woman who raised him. And worst of all, an explicit statement that I would always put her first, honoring and respecting her as the foundation of our marriage. My mother-in-law had actually rewritten my vows to center them around her. She had assumed I wouldn't read them before the ceremony, that I'd be too distracted or trusting to review them. She probably planned to hand them over at the last minute, ensuring that, unknowingly, I would read them in front of everyone, publicly committing myself to her before a room full of witnesses. But her plan failed miserably, because I discovered it in time. I folded the fake vows and put them in my pocket. Then I told the officiant to use the originals, the ones I had written. He nodded, visibly relieved that he had consulted with me first. I thanked him for his integrity. As I headed toward the ceremony, I saw my mother-in-law sitting in the front row, practically glowing with satisfaction. She had no idea that I knew about her plan and was about to teach her a lesson. I allowed myself a small but significant smile. This was going to be interesting. Music began. My father, standing beside me, gave me a reassuring squeeze of the hand before walking me down the aisle. I focused on my fiancé, my future husband, waiting for me at the altar. For a moment, everything else faded away. This was our day, and I wasn't going to let anyone ruin it. My mother-in-law, however, had other plans. As I passed the first row, I saw her sitting there, practically radiating pride as if she had orchestrated the entire event. She gave me a small nod, as if expecting some kind of gratitude. I kept my face serene and continued on. The ceremony began beautifully. The officiant spoke about love, companionship, and commitment without the slightest mention of my mother-in-law. Then came the time for the vows. I turned to look at my future husband, my heart racing, not from nerves, but because I knew what was about to happen. The officiant looked at me expectantly and gave me a slight signal. I reached into my pocket, my fingers brushing against the crumpled paper my mother-in-law had tried to slip me, but I pulled out my authentic vows. I unfolded them, took a deep breath, and began to speak. I put my whole heart into every word, expressing my love for my fiancé, my excitement for our future, and my promises to him as his wife, without a single mention of my mother-in-law. As I spoke, I witnessed the transformation in real time. My mother-in-law's face went from smug satisfaction to absolute confusion as she realized this wasn't what she had written. By the time the ceremony concluded and the officiant declared us husband and wife, I could almost feel the heat of her glare boring into me. My new husband kissed me, and the guests erupted in applause. But I knew the real fireworks were just beginning. As we walked back down the aisle hand in hand, I mentally prepared myself. My mother-in-law wasn't going to let this slide. And indeed, she didn't. By the time we reached the reception hall, I could already feel the tension building. She hadn't made a scene during the ceremony, but only because she had run out of options. There was no way she would let this pass without a fight. My mother-in-law kept her distance at first, but I observed her several times throughout the evening, and her fury was evident. She wasn't just upset, she was furious, and the more people congratulated me on my heartfelt vows, the worse it got. It didn't take long for her to finally explode. I was by the cake table, chatting with some friends. When I heard her, she had cornered my husband. I turned just in time to see her grab his arm, pulling him slightly aside, her face distorted. She was asking him what had happened, why he had changed the vows at the last minute, and if he was aware of it. My husband looked confused, as I never got around to telling him what had happened. However, he didn't cower. He assured her that the vows I had spoken were exactly what I had always planned to say, and that he had never expected anything different. As expected, that answer didn't satisfy her. She demanded to know why I had lied to her, and why I had promised to include her in my vows only to humiliate her in front of everyone. At that point, I decided I had heard enough. I approached where they were and made it clear that I had never promised her anything. That taking the liberty of rewriting my vows behind my back didn't constitute a promise, and that she couldn't expect me to discover it and do nothing about it. Even if I hadn't discovered it before the ceremony, I probably would have stopped reading the paper and said my vows from memory. I wasn't speaking particularly loudly, just explaining it to her, but you know what happens when someone speaks in a certain tone? Curious ears perk up. And I don't mean that in a negative way, it's happened to me too. If my mother-in-law's face had looked like a rabid beast before, now it looked like an enraged animal with avian flu and stomach cramps. She started screaming right there, in the middle of the reception, claiming that I had humiliated her, that I had disrespected her in front of all our family and friends. If there were people who hadn't found out until then, now everyone knew. She demanded to know why I was so determined to push her away when all she had ever wanted was to be included. I looked at her like, what is this woman talking about? In her mind, she really saw herself as the victim in all of this. But I didn't have to intervene, because that's what my father-in-law was for. He had been watching how everything unfolded, so he was in the right place at the right time. He told my mother-in-law that she needed to stop embarrassing herself and the family, that altering the wedding vows to make herself the center of the ceremony was inappropriate. That this day wasn't about her tantrums, but about other people, and that she should stop behaving that way. But do you think my mother-in-law cared that her own husband was telling her off? Do you think she admitted her mistake and apologized? Of course not. She only got angrier and snapped at him that all of this was his fault too. That if he had supported her, I would have agreed to dedicate some warm words to her on that day. My father-in-law looked completely exhausted. He simply shook his head and walked away, leaving her standing there, trembling with rage. My sister-in-law, who had been nearby, finally intervened, trying to calm her down. But she wanted nothing to do with it. She roughly pushed her arm away while saying she wasn't going to tolerate such treatment, that she was too important to be humiliated in front of everyone. Obviously, in her mind, we were all conspiring against her. She was the victim. And then, in a truly spectacular display of drama, she shot out of the hall, the doors slammed shut behind her, and, just like that, suddenly she was gone. No one knew exactly what to do. But then, almost as if it were rehearsed, my father-in-law sighed, clapped softly, and muttered something about finally being able to enjoy a meal in peace. Laughter spread through the room, and, thus, the tension dissipated. The rest of the day went smoothly. The food was delicious, the speeches were fun but sincere, and my husband and I danced to every tune that played. My mother-in-law may have tried to sabotage our wedding, but in the end, all she managed to do was embarrass herself. And honestly, I don't regret anything. Update 1. The morning after the wedding, I woke up with a smile. Not just because we were already married and had left all the wedding stress behind, but also because my mother-in-law had received a small dose of karma for what she tried to do. Despite her dramatic collapse, the night had ended wonderfully. But, as expected, the peace didn't last long. I had barely taken the first sip of my coffee when my phone started vibrating incessantly. At first I ignored it, thinking they were congratulations for the wedding. But then my husband's phone also started ringing, over and over again. I finally gave in and checked the messages. My mother-in-law hadn't resigned herself in silence. She had spent all night ranting on social media, posting that I had only married her son so I could humiliate her, that I had used the wedding to get revenge on her, how I had betrayed her and intentionally excluded her from the vows, even after promising to include her. She had twisted everything. In her version, she was the poor, innocent victim, in her own words. Her son was ungrateful, and I was an evil manipulator. And the worst part was that her post had generated an avalanche of reactions. Relatives who hadn't even attended the wedding were already taking sides. Some defended her, outraged because her only son had abandoned her for a selfish woman who didn't even acknowledge the woman who had raised him. Others were genuinely confused, wondering what she was talking about, because it seemed extremely strange to them that someone would decide to include their mother-in-law in their wedding vows. And then there were those who had attended the wedding. These openly criticized my mother-in-law, telling the truth and providing evidence. The comments section was absolute chaos. Some had even posted videos from the reception where my father-in-law clearly told her she had crossed the line. My mother-in-law, of course, wasn't handling it well. I hadn't even finished processing everything when I heard someone knocking at the door. I already knew who it was. My husband sighed deeply, running a hand over his face before muttering that we'd better face this at once. He opened the door, and there she was. My mother-in-law looked terrible, as if she had slept with her wedding makeup on, or as if she hadn't slept at all. She entered without being invited, throwing her hands in the air, demanding to know if we had seen how we had ruined her life. She waved her phone back and forth, showing her own self-inflicted disaster, screaming that she had been betrayed by the two people she loved most. She went on and on about how she would never have done that to her own mother-in-law, how she just wanted to be mentioned to thank her, and nothing more. But no, I had made an effort to humiliate her in front of everyone. My husband, showing admirable patience, tried to calm her down. He explained that it was she who had embarrassed herself, that no one had asked her to rewrite my vows, and that if she had respected our boundaries, none of this would have happened. But my husband defending me only enraged her more. She started yelling that he had changed since he met me, that before my arrival, she had been the most important person in his life, that she was his mother, and I had stolen him from her. I coldly replied that I hadn't stolen anything, that she was his mother but I was his wife. And the fact that she saw those two roles as competitors was exactly why we were in this situation, which was sick. For that comment, she put her hand to her chest as if I had physically struck her. Before she could start her next drama, my father-in-law arrived, and he wasn't in the mood. He had clearly followed her from home after seeing her leave in that altered state and with that neglected appearance. And from the moment he entered, he was already shaking his head as if he were fed up. He told my mother-in-law to stop making a fool of herself, that she was embarrassing herself again, and that if she expected him to support her, she was very wrong. My mother-in-law turned to him, genuinely surprised. She asked him how he could take my side after everything that happened, after she just wanted to be part of her son's wedding. My father-in-law looked at her for a long moment before telling her that she had no right to be the center of attention, just for being someone's mother. By then, my mother-in-law was a sea of tears, babbling that she had not only lost her son because of me, but also her husband. She asked him if he was having an affair with me, because only that would explain why he would defend me instead of his own wife. My father-in-law dryly replied that no affair or infidelity was needed for him not to support her, as she managed perfectly well on her own to achieve that. My husband asked her to leave, and I also indicated that it was time to go and stop making up excuses. My mother-in-law yelled at my father-in-law that he was the real problem, that he had never supported her, and that if he had been a better husband, perhaps their son wouldn't have abandoned her for a vengeful woman who wanted to erase her from his life. That was the last straw for my husband. For the first time since all this drama began, he raised his voice and told her that was enough. He explained that her obsession with being first in his life wasn't normal, that no mother with a healthy relationship would act like this, and that if she couldn't accept that he was married now, she would end up losing him completely. Just like at the wedding, she stormed out of the house furiously, but at least we got her to leave and stop accusing everyone of whatever crossed her mind. My father-in-law commented ironically that he was going to have a very peaceful afternoon now that she had another tantrum to focus on. Update 2. For a few blessed days of tranquility after my mother-in-law's dramatic exit, everything was calm. Too calm. I knew perfectly well that she hadn't given up. If I had learned anything about her, it was that she fed on drama, and if she wasn't at the center, she created a new situation that made her the protagonist. So when my husband received a call from his aunt, I wasn't surprised. Apparently, my mother-in-law had started a whole campaign to gather support. She had contacted everyone who had backed her in her first post to turn them into her army against me. An army of barely 5 people, probably as disheveled as she was. At that moment, I received a message from my mother asking if everything was okay because my mother-in-law had just called her, sounding absolutely devastated. My parents had been at the wedding, of course. Fortunately, my mother knew well what my mother-in-law was like, but not even she had imagined that she would try to manipulate my own family to turn them against me. I called my mother immediately. She told me that my mother-in-law had delivered a tearful 22-minute monologue about how she was being expelled from her own son's life. She had begged her to talk to me, saying she knew I was only acting out of spite, and that, deep down, I was a good person, because she had raised me, that she simply couldn't believe that I was so cruel as to completely eliminate her from her son's life. My mother let her talk and then asked her a simple question. Exactly how has she pushed you out of your son's life? My mother-in-law was speechless, visibly thrown off. She had expected my mother to help her after flattering her. She had assumed that presenting herself as the hurting mother would be enough to move my mother, to make my own parents scold me and force me to apologize. But my mother asked her that question and completely disarmed her. She explained that she had seen how I had repeatedly tried to include her in our lives, only to be met with constant invasions and demands. She reminded her that a mother's role changes when her son gets married, and that trying to force her presence into our vows was not only inappropriate, but disturbing. And finally, she advised her that if she really wanted to be part of her son's life, she had to stop making everything revolve around her and worry more about him and the things he loved, referring to me. My mother-in-law hung up on her. When my mother finished telling me everything, she sighed and warned me that this wasn't over. My mother-in-law hadn't given up, and she was right. The next day, my mother-in-law sent a mass message to the entire extended family. It was more of the same, so I won't go into details. The important thing was the consequences. Many people were tired of her lies and whining, so they started reprimanding her. Not even her little army came to her aid. She was so alone, it was almost pitiful. My husband finally responded in the group chat. I would have preferred him to do it in private, but she had been obstinate about making everything public, so he gave her what she wanted. He informed her that all communication ended there, and that any future contact would be through lawyers. He also explained exactly why he was cutting ties with her, and since the whole family was reading, it served as an explanation for everyone. He warned them that he didn't want to hear anyone talking to him about his mother, because the reasons for distancing were entirely her fault, so there was no one else to blame. And he advised them to stay out of it, because he wouldn't tolerate anyone, no matter who they were, saying anything to him about his poor mother. Then he left the group. Luckily, or unfortunately, I stayed and was able to read some responses. The vast majority, those who supported us, said they understood and promised not to bring up the subject again. My mother-in-law was expelled from the group by the administrator. The few defenders of my mother-in-law said absolutely nothing. Only my father-in-law commented something, that like my husband, he didn't want to make it public. But since that was the battlefield chosen by my mother-in-law, he would also make an announcement to clear any doubts. He revealed that he was separating from my mother-in-law and had been living alone for several days. Even I didn't know that, and when I told my husband, he didn't seem to be aware of it either. Update 3. With all the wedding chaos behind us, my husband and I packed our bags and went on our honeymoon. After everything my mother-in-law had done, we weren't going to let her foolishness ruin our plans. The first few days were pure happiness. No calls, no manipulative messages, no headaches caused by my mother-in-law. And the following days too, because we had blocked her. But I did do something a little vengeful. Every time we took a nice photo of our honeymoon, whether enjoying a luxurious dinner, relaxing on the beach, or simply sipping cocktails, I would unblock my mother-in-law just long enough to send her the image, and then block her again before she could respond. It was petty, it was immature, but it was immensely satisfying. My husband didn't even mind. If anything, he found it hilarious. He even started making up comments to add to the photos, like, "After this, we're going to buy a gift for my mother-in-law. Oh, that's right, I don't have one," and things like that. When my father-in-law found out what I was doing, he nearly choked with laughter. He told my husband that I was now his favorite person. Apparently, my mother-in-law was calling and texting him, screaming about how I was deliberately torturing her. But my father-in-law wasn't responding anymore. He was more focused on making his separation permanent. Yes, at that point, he was already planning the divorce. Update 4. I've heard that many are forming a fan club for my father-in-law, calling him the MVP of this story. I think I'm a little jealous. Just kidding. My father-in-law has really done a lot in this story, both for us and for himself. From the day of my wedding, he seemed exhausted with his marriage, so the divorce is not just a show of support for us, but primarily an act of liberation for himself. Because living with my mother-in-law is worse than, well, I can't think of anything worse. But that's in the past now, and my father-in-law is divorced. And for those who have suggested that dementia is not something to be taken lightly, I should clarify that my mother-in-law has been medically evaluated and shows no signs of dementia. She's simply like that, a narcissistic woman with delusions of grandeur who can't understand that not everything revolves around her. She may be unbalanced, a terrible mother, a bad wife, and an awful mother-in-law, behave horribly, be possessed, or put on makeup without a mirror. But at least she'll never try to be a K-pop singer. I'll tell my father-in-law later. I'm sure he'll find it funny, though I'm not sure if he knows what K-pop is. I'd be surprised if he did.